there, and welcome to the channel. My name's Dominic, and in this video, we're gonna go over my color grading techniques inside of Adobe Premiere Pro. Let's jump in. So here we are inside of Premiere. I've got 3 clips here, all shot in different environments. This one was shot in overcast, outside. This one was shot at night under these blue Christmas lights. And this one was shot in my studio with studio lighting. I'm gonna start with this first shot here. Typically what I like to do is do a base correction on the video clip itself, just to get the waveform looking how I want it. So I usually start by getting my black points and my white points set. So here we can see that I wanna bring my curves usually all the way down till it's just about to touch 0. And then I usually bring my whites up just a little bit. Adds a little bit of contrast in the image. Pump a little saturation into there. So once I have my clip dialed in the way I want it, I'll go ahead and add an adjustment layer on top. This is my actual color grade, which sets the look for the entire film. So we'll go ahead and make a new adjustment layer and drag that on top of our clip. And now we can start dialing in this image even further. Add a little bit of contrast in here. I like to bring my white point down to kind of hide any blown out highlights. This clip was shot in HLG, which when recorded, it has a slight green tinge to the video, and it makes all of the skin tones look kind of yellowy. So we're gonna come down here to our HSL curves, and we're gonna go to the hue versus hue. Our skin tones usually live right in here in the orange color, so we're gonna put a point there and some points out here and kind of dial in our skin tones so they look more natural. And one thing I found too is that a lot of people like to push things more orange, and they even pull the reds orange as well. But if you do that, there's no texture and there's no depth in skin tones because everything is just orange. So if you pull your orange up more red, I find it best if you also grab your reds and pull them slightly more magenta to keep that definition in the skin tones. Otherwise, if you pull it down to match, everything just blends in and there is no character to the skin tones. So we'll kind of dial this up. We'll show it before and after, and that's looking pretty good. Next up, I usually put a point here and here, and then I grab the deep greens and I pull them slightly blue to make them look a little richer. Then I grab my yellows, which are on the high end of the greens, and pull them more orange, ever so slightly. So see before and after. I also always shoot my footage without any in-camera sharpening, so we'll add a little bit of sharpening back into here. 25 usually is good. Next up, we're gonna add a little bit of tint to our highlights. This adds a little bit of warmth into the highlights. This is a great way to add warmth into the footage, but when you're shooting something like a wedding, the wedding dress is white, and if you do this, it'll make the wedding dress look not white anymore and slightly off-white, this ivory look. So to correct that, we'll come down to our curves, scroll down to our Luma versus saturation. To understand this tool, the left side is our shadows and the right side is our highlights, and the vertical values are saturation. So if I put a point here, here, and here, I can bump up the saturation to all of the midtones while leaving the highlights and the shadows alone. So I'm gonna put a point here and grab our high points and bring them down just a bit. So if we turn this on and off, watch right here as I turn this on and off. You can see how it's bringing out our white values back to white while still retaining this warmth just below the highlights. That is pretty much all with this shot, so let's move on to the next one. So this shot has a lot of saturation from the blue lights in the area. This one's gonna need a lot more correcting up front to get it to a good spot. If you wanna leave it like this, that's totally fine if that's the look you're going for. But for this shot in my last video, I actually did a lot of correction to the midtones and really brought it back to a neutral look before applying the color grade on top of that. So let's jump into the correction of this shot. First, we're gonna dial in our contrast using the curves again. That's looking good. Next up, we're gonna go to the color wheels, and this is where we're gonna really correct this image before we do any sort of color grading. This was shot in my Sony a7S III at 4K 10-bit 422, so there's a lot of detail and a lot of information here that we can push around to try and correct the image the way we want to. We can see there's a ton of blue in the midtones because we were shooting under blue lights, so I'm gonna try to mitigate that by pulling this against blue in the midtones and bring back the color and life in Paul's midtones. That's getting there. Next up, we're gonna bring the highlights as well. Pull these back. Like so. Looking better. And now I can see there's a lot of red in our shadows, so we're gonna push these slightly blue. Also, when I'm correcting the shadows, I'm keeping an eye over here because this will let me know what the saturation of each color is looking like in the shadows. So you can see as I pull it more towards magenta, more green shows up on the bottom end of the shadows. That means that it's very pink. Likewise, if I go over towards the green, more magenta and red is showing up over here, meaning that it's way more green. So we're gonna kind of dial this in so it looks nice and neutral. Like that. That's looking good. Let's kind of dial these in a bit. We'll also add a little bit of saturation in here. Maybe mess with our temperature a little bit to pull it a little bit warmer. All right, so I think that's pretty good for the correction of this shot. If you look here, we'll take a look at the before and the after. And this is the power of the 10-bit and the 422 on the Sony a7S III. It retains so much detail and so much information, then you can really push these colors around to get it to the point where it's looking the way you want it to. So now we'll grab our adjustment layer and drag it on top of this clip, and we'll start dialing it in the way we want to. So the first thing I'm seeing is that our white points here are looking very yellow compared to what it was before. So we're gonna go into our curves, come all the way down here to our luma versus saturation, kind of pull these back to make them white again. Next up, we'll kind of correct these skin tones a little bit. So we'll come over here to our hue versus hue, set a few points all throughout here. Let's see what we're affecting. Kind of dial this in a bit. For this particular shot, there's a bit of green on the front of his face, so if we grab our green and pull it up towards yellow a little bit more, it helps to correct that part of the image. For this look, I kind of want to desaturate our blues a bit. Into the greens a little bit as well. And then make our orange really pop. Let's see the before, the after. To add a little bit of color contrast, let's come up here to the creative tab again. And we've got our highlight and shadow tint. I might pump a little bit of warmth back into the highlights. And then we're gonna grab the shadows and pull them slightly blue. Just a little bit. Then we can use the tint balance, which will shift the midpoint between these two colors. So if I pull it this way, the highlight range comes way down. And if I push it this way, the shadow range comes way up. So we'll kind of dial this somewhere here. I want a little more warmth in this than the shadows. Next up, I think I'm going to go back to the curves and come down to our luma versus saturation. Put a point here and just desaturate our shadows a bit, just so they're looking good there. I'm not really happy with the green in here, so I'm going to desaturate a bit of the green some more. This is a tough shot to grade because of how far we push the image initially. Let's add a little bit more contrast into the image. I'm not loving this back in here, so I'm wondering if there's a way to pull, I don't know what that is. Slow this down. Something like that. All right, so there is the final look of this shot. So next up is this shot from my last video, the settings for my Sony a7S III, which you should check out if you haven't already. So we're gonna start off by doing a little bit of base correction on this one. It's a very dark image, but I still want it to be kind of punchy, so we'll bring these down a bit. Bring our highlights up. One thing to note is that skin tones should usually sit between 60 and 70 IRE. So you can see here, my skin tones are hitting above that. So what I like to do is kind of grab the mid-tones here and pull them down a bit to get them into that area. Next up, we'll pump a little bit of saturation into the image. That looks good. And here you can really see that with shooting in HLG, my skin has this kind of greenish tint to it, which pushes it more yellow than it is supposed to be. So I think we're all set with the color correction here. Next, we're gonna grab our adjustment layer and put it back on top of here. And now we can start to dial in all of these colors. First, I'm gonna come down here to the curves and correct our skin tones. Also gonna come over here to the blues. Next up, I wanna bring my blues down a little bit. This line here is a little bit distracting, so I wanna kind of just desaturate that a little bit. For this shot, I want the contrast to be there, but I also want a slight fade on the shadows. So to do that, we're gonna put a point here. It's already pretty contrasty, so I'll just tweak it a little bit, put it around about right there. Put a point here, and then we're gonna grab the bottom. We're gonna just pull this up a little bit. And this adds a nice fade. You can see it's lifted up all of my shadows a bit, but it's still kind of retaining that contrast. If you want 100% accurate color on your skin tones, here's a little trick you can do to dial that in perfectly. So we're gonna click on our clip, we're gonna go up to Effects, go to Mask, I'm gonna zoom in here a bit, and on my face, we're gonna create a mask on this part of my face because it's unaffected by the yellow light over here. Next, we're going over to the Lumetri colors, and make sure to bring up your YUV vector scope, and this will show all the colors in the image that we have masked. This line here is the skin tone line, so this is the line we want everything to sit along to make sure the skin tones are reproduced correctly. And like I said before, HLG shifts the oranges slightly yellow, so we're not going to be affecting the entire image, just the skin tones in this instance. So we're going to come over here to the curves again, come down to our hue versus hue. We're going to grab our skin tones again, but this time we're going to keep an eye on the colors and make sure they line up with this line. So we're going to drag up to bring in more magenta. Pull our reds up a little bit. All right, so once that looks good, we can go ahead and disable our mask. Zoom out here. What a difference this has made from this to this. And now we know that those skin tones are 100% accurate. So that's pretty much my process for doing color grading inside of Premiere Pro. Obviously, this was a bit of a quick run through, and sometimes shots can get more complicated than this, but this was supposed to be pretty much just a quick tutorial on how I do my color grading. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for sticking around. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to drop a like if you enjoyed the video, and hit that subscribe button if you don't want to miss out on future content. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.